I'd like to go ahead now and turn the floor over to our program director, Lori Lacefield, who will introduce our speaker for the evening. Lori?
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
So tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce David Heska Wanbli Weiden. He's an enrolled citizen of the, I'll probably butcher this, and I'm sorry, Sikanju, but you can correct me, Lakota Nation, is the author of the novel Winter Counts, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and Indie Next Pick. Winter Counts was named the best book of 2020 by Publishers Weekly, Library Journal, Amazon, and NPR, a notable selection by Crime Reads, a main selection of the Book of the Month Club, and has been shortlisted for an Edgar, well, we know, for Best First Novel. I think he probably will win too. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Shenandoah, Yellow Medicine Review, Transmotion, and other magazines. He's a professor of Native American Studies at Metropolitan State University of Denver. So welcome, David.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I am David Heska Wanbli Weiden, and the nation is the Sicangu Lakota Nation, or in English, the Rosebud Sioux Tribe. It is really an honor to be here, but I feel honestly more than a little bit awkward and embarrassed, because I'm going to be speaking tonight about diverse voices in crime fiction, and we have really somebody that's been a hero of mine for a long time, Manuel Ramos, who is really one of the most groundbreaking authors that we have. And so I feel a little bit, and not only that, but I'm a very junior member of this chapter. And so I feel more than a little bit awkward. And so I truly thank you for the invitation to speak to you. But I come to you in a real spirit of humbleness and gratitude for, you folks embracing me into this chapter, and to the crime fiction community for taking, for really accepting this poor kid from one of the worst neighborhoods in Denver, in the reservation, and really embracing me. So again, I grew up in Denver. I'm a Denver native. I grew up in the Swansea, Elyria neighborhood. If you don't know where that is by the dog food factory. And by the way, my sound is coming in okay, right? Okay, good. I'm still really paranoid about that. So I grew up by the dog food factory in Swansea. I am an enrolled citizen of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe. My mother grew up on the reservation, as did all of my family, so I would spend summers there. So my second home is in South Dakota. That's where my nation is. Later, when I was about 10, I grew up in Aurora. I moved to Aurora, North Aurora, and I went to Aurora Central High School. So I'm a Denverite through and through. I'm a college professor at Metro State University, as you mentioned. I was teaching at a school in New York, but I got a call from Metro. They said, "Are you interested in coming back to Denver?" And I said, "Heck yeah, I am." Because the students at Metro State are students a lot like me. I'm a first generation college student. Neither of my parents graduated from college. They didn't know the first thing about college. When it came time, I had to figure all that out on my own. I worked every year of high school and college and graduate school. And the students at Metro State University are a lot like me. They are interested in an education. They're hungry to learn. Many of them are students of color. Many of them are first generation. We have a lot of military veterans. So I took a pretty massive pay cut, and I left New York to come back home, and I've never regretted it for a minute. So it's my honor to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about some of the changes that are happening in crime fiction. I'll talk about a few things, and then I'll open it up for questions. I'm happy to talk about some of the changes, wonderful changes that are happening in mystery and suspense fiction. I'm also happy to talk about the publishing process in general. So I debuted during this pandemic, and boy, was it crazy. So I'm also happy, if anybody has a question about what it was like to debut, how that has changed. I'm certainly no expert in any of this, but I can tell you a little bit about what I've learned by dealing with, selling foreign rights. I'm not allowed to say anything yet, but I can tell you about selling movie rights, You know, I'm certainly happy to answer those questions as well. But I just want to preface this by saying that I do not consider myself to be an expert on the publishing process or on crime literature. You know, I'm a professor of Native American Studies. I'm not a professor of English. So in law and political issues, I feel fairly well qualified. In literature, much less so. I suppose the only qualification I have is I did do my Master of Fine Arts degree at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I did write my critical thesis on Native American literature and crime noir. So I suppose that is my one and only qualification to speak about crime literature. In addition to teaching at Metro State University, I'm on the Master of Fine Arts faculty at Western Colorado University in Gunnison. They have a wonderful program in genre writing. I teach there. I am, at least for the time being, on the faculty of the MFA program at Vermont College of Fine Arts. That program actually is shutting down. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that or not. It is changing. And so the MFA program in writing and publishing is being folded into the writing program. And so I believe that I'll probably just be moving to teaching writing in Western Colorado exclusively. Okay, so let me talk a little bit tonight about, you know, diverse voices in crime fiction. So tonight's, you know, sort of little discussion is the new wave of diverse voices in crime fiction. And, you know, if you've been doing any reading in some of the blogs or the crime magazines, it seems like there are some really exciting things happening. You know, arguably the most lauded crime novel of the year was by my buddy Sean Cosby. He writes as S.A. Cosby. His book, Blacktop, Wasteland, is fantastic. If you read Deadly Pleasures magazine, George Easter compiles the mentions and the best of, you know, all of those. He compiled 50 best of the year lists, and Sean Cosby came in at 22 mentions as one of the best books of the year. So if you haven't read Blacktop Wasteland, that's a superb book. But there's so many others. You know, there's really something happening in crime fiction. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, to kind of set up the context for this, Writer's Digest magazine recently said in an article that the crime fiction genre has historically lacked diversity. That's what they said. Now, my impression, and again, I'm not an expert, I'm just an observer, I'm just a writer, but my impression is that many writers of color have tended to gravitate more towards what we would call literary fiction. This is certainly true in Native American literature. When you think about some of the better known Native writers, you tend to think of, in the past, Sherman Alexie, that's a whole other issue, Louise Erdrich. My friend Tommy Orange, my friend and classmate, wrote a book that did quite well, shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize. So he did okay. You know, he's doing all right, you know, not great, but all right. His book, there, you know. And so they all tend to write, you know, literary fiction. And so, you know, why is that? Why have there been so few, you know, comparatively, so few writers of color in the mystery and suspense, you know, field? You know, that's a good question. I don't know that I have an answer for that. I will give you just a few statistics here. One study found that since 1994, all books written by writers of color have hovered around 10%. So only 10% of all books published in all genres have been written by writers of color. Now, before 1994, it was almost certainly much lower than that. Okay, so it was almost certainly much lower. So, you know, so I'm not aware of any formal study in crime fiction as to how many books have been published by what we call BIPOC authors, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color. I suspect it was probably less than 5% up until the 1990s, okay? Now, one reason why this might be that's been posited is the fact that the publishing industry is not very diverse itself. Now there, we do have some statistics. Lee and Lowe did a survey of all of the big 5 publishing houses and many of the small publishing houses agencies, literary agencies, trade journals, and they wanted to get an estimate of what is the makeup of employees of the publishing industry. And so in 2019, they published this survey, and what they found is that the publishing industry, the employees are 76% white. I'm going to use their terminology here, 76% white, 74% cis women, 81% straight, again, their terminology, and 89% non-disabled. Okay, so what we get from these numbers is that the publishing industry itself, interestingly enough, tends to be heavily, again, to use their term, cis female, cis women, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly heterosexual, and non-disabled. So the argument is that if we don't have editors that understand multicultural literature, they're not likely to buy it. If we don't have agents that understand it, they're not likely to be able to sell it. My partner is the native writer Erica Worth, and so she's not a crime writer, but she's been trying to find an agent. She's gone through a couple of agents, and she wanted to go to an indigenous agent. Well, here's the problem: there aren't any. You know, the only one that we have been able to find is a gentleman in Canada. Okay, so this is interesting. Of the hundreds and hundreds of literary agents, there is apparently not one native agent, not one indigenous agent. Okay, now that is fascinating to me. I'm not aware of any indigenous editors. Okay, now let me be clear. I love my agent. I'm represented by Brower at Avita's Creative Management. I love her. She's been great. And my editors at Echo, HarperCollins, have been superb. So I love my people. But you know, the argument is that there's not diversity within the publishing industry, and so this translates into a lack of sales for diverse crime novels. Okay, so that is sort of the overview. Now, there is, however, I'll move on to the next subtopic. There have been obviously some notable exceptions. Now, I'm not going to give a lecture here. I'll probably just kind of skip over a lot of this, and I don't pretend to be a literary scholar, but certainly I'm just going to talk briefly about Black and Native crime writers. And again, obviously, we have the trailblazing Manuel Ramos right here with us. But African-American crime novels, I did a little search on the net, and Otto Penzler, whom a lot of us know of, he did an anthology called Black Noir, and he claims that the first Black crime writer was W. Adolph Roberts, who wrote 3 mystery novels in 1926. So that's what he says. And then he mentions Rudolph Fisher and, of course, Chester Himes, whom I love. So if you're aware of Chester Himes, he wrote his first story in 1933. So there are certainly, many exceptions to this. And we can't leave Black crime writers without mentioning the wonderful Walter Mosley, okay? This is Otto Penzler again. I'll just read his words. The debut of Easy Rawlins in Devil in a Blue Dress, 1990, marked the beginning of the crossover era in which white readers didn't need to feel virtuously liberal for reading a Black mystery writer. They could read it for the pure pleasure of reading an excellent novel about fascinating original characters. Okay, so those are Otto Penzler's words. So he's noting the importance of Walter Mosley. Now, I'll just skip over to Native crime fiction, and then we'll get to the current events here and what's happening today. So Native American, that's actually a term. We tend to not use Native American. We tend to just use Native. My people, we don't mind the term Indian. The Southwestern Indians, they don't care for that. The Navajos don't like that, but my people, the Lakota, we embrace the word Indian. But anyway, I get asked that a lot. They're like, is Indian a slur? Not to us. The Navajos don't like it, but I'll just stick with Native American. So Native American crime fiction has a long history. Indeed, the first novel ever written by a Native author was a crime novel. Okay, now that's interesting. So the first Native novel ever was a crime novel, and this would be The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, 1854 by John Rollin Rich. Okay, so that's the first Native novel ever. Now, it did not have indigenous characters. The protagonist was from Mexico. Okay, so interestingly enough. I have read it, it's good, I mean, it's kind of, it's dated, but it's good. The next really important Native crime writer is the fascinating George Todd Downing. Okay. He's a golden age crime writer in the 1930s. He writes a book, Vultures in the Sky, is probably his best crime novel. So he is Native, all right, Native American, but he never wrote a novel featuring indigenous characters or set on native lands, native territory, okay, which is fascinating to me. Now, he's undergoing something of a renaissance. Otto Penzler just republished Vultures in the Sky in his in-house publishing imprint. And there's a biography that was published a few years ago of George Todd Downing. So he's a really important figure, but isn't it telling that he did not feel empowered to write a novel featuring Native characters, okay? For that, the first novel written, by a Native and featuring Native characters, it depends on definitions here. Some people would say Linda Hogan and Mean Spirit. I'm going to go with the legendary Martin Cruz Smith. Martin Cruz Smith, who is fantastic. I mean, I think we all know him here, right? He wrote the fantastic Gorky Park, Now, what I didn't know is that Martin Cruz Smith is indigenous. He is Pueblo. And he actually wrote some really fascinating novels. His 1977 book, Nightwing, I will submit, is the first true Native crime novel and almost certainly the first Native thriller, if we want to break it down that way. And it's just been reissued as well. It's interesting. It's an interesting book. It's kind of a hybrid. It's a crime novel and thriller set on a reservation, yet it's also got some supernatural elements. It was made into a movie back in the day. I have the movie on DVD. I no longer have a DVD player, so I am unable to see it, but someday I'll watch it. Word is that the movie is terrible, but I'll give it a shot. But Martin Cruz Smith is a really fascinating writer. He wrote another book that is now out of print called The Indians Won. The Indians Won. Now, his book, The Indians Won, he writes it 2 years after being out of college. He's out of college for 2 years, and he writes this novel, and he sells it to one of these pulp companies. And it is one of the first alternate history novels. It's not a crime novel, but it's a novel. He writes a novel about what would have happened if the Native nations back in the 1800s had banded together and fought the Americans, fought the colonizers, and won. What if the Indians won and they were able to fight off the Americans? And so he writes a novel where there's a nation called the Indian Nation in the middle of America. So roughly you've got like the West Coast, which is USA, then the Indian Nation, which is the middle of the country, and then the East Coast, which is the USA. And so it is a fascinating novel written by somebody that is 26 years old at the time. It's a little clunky. You can see that his writing skills needed to be, refined, but it is, the concept is just fascinating. And for somebody 26 to come up with this, I have argued that it should be reissued because I think it's an important book in the Native American literary canon. But it's tough to get. Just a pulp paperback costs about $100 if you can find it. Now, interestingly enough, I'm online about a month or two ago, and somebody friends me on Facebook and says, "I really love Winter Counts, Dave. And by the way, I read your article. Oh, you found it for $44. Okay, cool. Okay, that's a bargain. Cost $3 back in the day. So but now it's 44. So I'm on Facebook, and this woman owns a bookstore or something, and she's super nice. Her name is Louisa Smith. And she's like, by the way, you know, I really enjoyed the words you wrote about Martin Cruz Smith. By the way, he's my dad. What? Okay. And so that was really cool. And so she sent her dad, who I believe lives in England. He's a little sick, you know, I'm not going to violate the privacy, but send him a copy of Winter Counts. And I would love to interview him if his health can hold up, because I really think that Martin Cruz Smith needs to be reconceptualized as one of the really important Native writers. Because when we think of him, we think about Gorky Park and the movie with William Hurt, but he's a really important Native writer and in the Native crime tradition. And so I really think that it needs to be rethought. All right, so there is a history of Native American crime. It really starts taking off in the 1990s and 2000s. So some really important novels are written in the Native crime tradition. Lewis Owens is probably one of my heroes. He's not as well known. He had one Big Five novel and then some University Press novels, but he's a really important, maybe the most important Native American crime writer. And I have a whole article in which I mention him on Crime Reads. If you want to track that down, if you're having a tough time going to sleep, read this, it'll put you right out. So Lewis Owens is important, and there's some other really important crime writers. I'm not going to spend too much time on them. Carol Lefevre is the first LGBTQ Native crime writer, to my knowledge. There are many others, Marty Medawar, and even my friend Stephen Graham Jones. If you know Stephen Graham Jones, he teaches up in Boulder. He's known as an Indigenous horror writer, but he has a really important book out that's now out of print that came out, I want to say 2000, called All the Beautiful Sinners. And I've argued that it is one of the most important Native crime novels, All the Beautiful Sinners. It was published by some press that's now out of print, but then he sold it. The rights came back to him and he sold it to, I'm not sure how to say this, Dzank Books. It's a small house and you can get it online pretty easily, but in print, it's not easy to find. And then later on, we have some really important crime writers, Native crime writers, Marcy Rendon, Linda Rodriguez, and even Louise Erdrich, who her book, The Roundhouse, which won the National Book Award, really is a crime novel, okay? But the point that I'm getting at here is Native Americans have not really felt drawn to the crime genre as many other people of color. So now I'm going to skip up to the current day. So I've given just the briefest of introductions here to writers of color in the mystery and suspense field. Let's now zoom to the current day, all right? So obviously, this has been a crazy year for all of us. Not only the pandemic, but think back to just last summer and the shooting of George Floyd and others. I mean, so the Black Lives Matter movement, which really came to the forefront, you know, those shootings, I think it's fair to say, really shook American society, if not the world. And I think it really focused our attention on many social justice issues. So that is something I think that awakened a lot of eyes. It awakened a lot of folks, opened some eyes in the publishing world that maybe we need, you know, to start publishing people of color, and maybe crime fiction might be the ideal vehicle in which to bring some attention to these issues of social and racial justice. Now, at the same time, there's another movement going on that you may not be aware of if you're not deeply tied in to writers of color movement. It is called the Publishing Paid Me controversy. So the Publishing Paid Me controversy starts erupting kind of underground about the same time last summer. And it turns out that, you know, we all tend to be very, very coy about what we get paid for our advances, right? We don't, you know, it's embarrassing, right? It's taboo. We don't like to talk about money, okay? And so what happened though is somebody put it on Twitter with the hashtag Publishing Paid Me, and they said, look, minority writers, we need to talk about how much we're getting paid. And before you know it, you have lots and lots of famous folks talking, writers of color, talking not just in crime, but all genres, talking about how much they got paid. And it was, quite frankly, shocking. Now, the one that shocked me is the wonderful Black writer Jessamine Ward, who won the National Book Award, I think twice, I believe twice, okay? Jessamine Ward wins the National Book Award, and it turns out that she had to fight for an advance of $100,000. And other people were weighing in, white writers were weighing in, and there's this other gentleman who's like, yeah, I'm a debut writer, I got 1.2 million, you know? And the publishing paid me controversy kind of revealed that writers of color are being paid less systematically across the board. So this, I think, opened a lot of eyes as well. And so there's now a phrase that's going around writers of color, we call it white writer money. And so they're like saying, you know, we need, you know, writers of color need to start getting white writer money. And maybe that's starting to happen. You know, the thing is, everybody's all embarrassed and we kind of keep quiet about it, you know. So those are two things that happened this summer. We're all cooped up, you know, because of the pandemic. We're glued to the TV. We're watching, you know, cops killing George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and riots, and then publishing paid me controversy is happening. So things are happening in the publishing world. Now, let me move on to the next subtopic. I think some interesting occurrences and changes are happening in the publishing world. For one example, there's just starting in 2018, there's an internet group called Crime Writers of Color. And crime writers of color, obviously, it's kind of self-explanatory, can meet on the web, it's an internet group, and cheer each other on, talk about which agents and editors are amenable to these sorts of issues and books. So that's happening. We're also seeing a lot of new imprints being developed. Random House One World, if you're not aware, Random House One World, it's not a crime press, but they will publish crime books. They started going about, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. They're focusing on marginalized writers. Agora Books is exclusively crime, and it is for writers of color. Just last week, a new imprint opened up called Heart Drum through HarperCollins. Now, it is for Native authors only. It's a kid's book imprint, so it doesn't really affect crime writers. But that's a brand new thing, which was started by my friend Cynthia Leidig-Smith, who has created a whole new imprint. And then Cinco Puntos has been publishing great stuff. Arte Publico has been doing great stuff as well. You know, but we've got some new imprints that are starting to occur. And, you know, just for grins, before I came on tonight, I took a look at the Edgar Award nominations. And I took a look at who was nominated for Best Novel, Best First Novel, and Best Paperback Original. Intriguingly enough, I'm seeing that 7 of 16 nominees are of color. So that's 44%. So that's kind of fascinating to me. So what I'm getting here, my point is that I think some changes are happening. Okay, I think we're seeing that the publishing industry is opening up to previously marginalized voices. I've already mentioned my friend S.A. Cosby, who wrote probably the crime book of the year. Steph Cha is a wonderful writer. John Vercher, Tori Eldridge. I could go on and on. Attica Locke, Naomi Hirahara. You know, these are all folks of color that are really doing some groundbreaking work. All right, but I want to shift gears now. So now we kind of have the lay of the land. We've got the lay of the land. We kind of see where we're coming from. Now the question is, what, if anything, is different about multicultural crime fiction? How does it differ? What can multicultural crime fiction bring to the table? Why should we pay attention? Okay, how does it differ? Okay. So I have done a lot of thinking about this, and I want to point out you know, every writer obviously writes in a different style. You've got many writers of color that are writing, you know, traditional detective stories, that are writing cozies, you know, but some are doing noir. I mean, they're you know, they're all over the board. But I would say that what a subset of folks are doing is that, here's my point here, is what multicultural crime literature is bringing to the table is that these books are bringing attention to legal and political issues, and they're sort of they're issuing a call to action. Okay, so bringing attention to social injustices, racial issues, okay, social justice issues, I think this is one of the ways in which crime fiction can really lead the way, okay? And I think that a number of crime writers are doing that. And it's not always explicit. It's often done, by implication, okay? I read the works of Attica Locke, and I learn a lot about what it's like to be Black in Houston and the racism that goes on and being a police officer there. My own work in Winter Counts, in my book, I talk about a number of issues. I talk about the Major Crimes Act. If you're not aware, the Major Crimes Act is a law which was passed in 1885, which forbids Native nations from prosecuting felony crimes that occur on their own lands. Okay, so let's say on my nation, the Rosebud Sioux tribe, somebody rapes a little girl. Okay, sad to say this happens. And they catch the guy, we'll make it a guy, and the Native law enforcement, tribal police, because it's a felony crime, they have to call the FBI and the US Attorney's Office. They have to refer the case to federal authorities. We are not allowed to prosecute crimes, felonies that occur on our own lands, only misdemeanors. Now, okay, fine. Here's the problem. Federal authorities are declining to prosecute about 30 to 40% of these cases. And these figures are coming from the federal government themselves. So I just want you to understand what's going on here. Somebody has raped a little girl. They call up the US Attorney's Office and the FBI. The FBI investigates, and then for reasons that we can talk about later, they say, we're going to decline prosecution. And the rapist, the child abuser, is set free. He is set free. Now, that is an outrage. That is outrageous. And my book deals with a hired vigilante, Virgil Wounded Horse. What happens on many Native reservations is that if you can't get justice from the criminal justice system, you call up a hired vigilante that will beat up the rapist for a price. And that is the subject of my book. Now, I have found that very few people know about the Major Crimes Act. They are not aware of this true injustice. And so my book hopefully has started a little bit of a discussion. I've gotten calls from 3 different lawmakers. I've gotten a call from the dean of a major law school, and I've gotten calls, emails from US attorneys. The US attorneys from North Dakota said, you got it exactly right, Dave. This is outrageous what is happening on Native reservations. This law needs to be changed. So imagine if you're in Denver, if we were letting 30 to 40% of abusers, rapists, murderers, arsonists just walk the streets. There'd be an uproar, there would be marches in the streets. It's outrageous. So that is, sort of the main issue of my book. I cover other issues. People don't know that our juvenile justice system is really messed up. And I cover spirituality. I find that very few people are aware of the fact that American Indian religion was criminalized until 1978. So our religious tradition was made a felony crime until the year 1978. That's a true fact, okay? We were forbidden from practicing our religion until the year 1978. And folks don't know this. And when I teach this to my students or people read my book or I speak to a lot of book clubs, the first question I get is, Dave, this is not right. What about the First Amendment and freedom of religion? And I tell them, I say, well, the Constitution, unfortunately, is not always applied fairly to people of color and other oppressed groups. It's just not, okay? It is outrageous that we were not able to practice our religion until 1978. We weren't allowed to vote until 1924. And even after that, a number of states still forbade us from voting in federal elections, including Colorado, I'm sad to say. So American citizens, if we happen to be Native, we were not allowed to vote in elections, including Colorado. So I mean, this is just one of, that's not in my book, that's just a side note, you know. And so there are a lot of these issues, you see, that I find that folks don't know about. And I would argue that crime fiction is the ideal vehicle to bring awareness to some of these issues. And so that is what I think what multicultural voices can bring to the table. Now I'm going to make a second point, and then I'll start to wrap it up here, because I want there to be time for questions. And I think we just go till 8 or a little bit after 8. The other argument that's been made as to what multicultural crime fiction can bring to the table does not come from me, but it comes from the writer John Fram and others. He's a crime writer. And the argument is that multicultural crime fiction can often decenter the detective or the police officer. To put that in a less academic way, maybe more books can be written about folks that are not always detectives or, you know, police procedurals, that often the focus can be placed elsewhere. Now, of course, the noir tradition does this as well, you know, but John Fram argues that crime fiction should be used as a vehicle to bring attention to police misconduct. So John Fram, F-A-R-M, wrote a nice article in the New York Times back in, I want to say, June. I'll read a little bit from it here. This is not my argument. This is the wonderful writer, John Fram. His words here, quote, "Some of the first organized police systems were designed to catch runaway slaves, keep tabs on Native American populations, break up riots, and protect the private property of the white and wealthy. The police were the main weapons deployed against Black Americans after slavery was abolished, and white property owners, suddenly bereft of free labor, exploited a loophole in the 13th Amendment that was just wide enough to march a chain gang through." I'll read just a little bit more of his. Most Americans, by which he means non-native, we can go to 8:15, okay. But most Americans have never been stopped and frisked, have never had their door kicked in by an officer serving a warrant, or been put in a chokehold. Their exposure to the police comes from books and TV shows, and these stories condition them to think that police violence is normal. Think about Dirty Harry, Lethal Weapon, Blue Bloods. Police officers are always beating people up to get information out of them. This can translate into people thinking excessive force is justified, perhaps especially if a suspect is Black. In the meantime, white crime writers need to wake up and realize that people are dying, and our work can be a powerful tool for change. What are we doing right now to fight the racism plaguing our nation's law enforcement? End quote. Now, again, that's John Fram's argument. I mean, I'm not telling you that I endorse it all the way. I'm going to let John speak for himself, you know, but I think he raises a powerful critique of white crime writers, you know, all crime writers. Are we doing enough to sort of discuss some of these issues? And you know, that's a really, really fascinating issue. So let me, you know, and again, I'll let you guys come to your own conclusions on that. I'm going to do one last subtopic here, and I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit, and that would be frequently asked questions. So I am very often asked a number of questions when I speak at events or whatever, and so I just thought that I would hire a couple of them. I thought I would bring up a couple of these questions that might be of use to folks, and then we can have a talk about this. I don't expect you to agree with everything I've said or what John Fram has said or what Otto Penzler has said. I'm just trying to start a dialogue tonight and just have some fun. So, but frequently asked questions. So I get this a lot. Is it okay for a white author to write a Native American character? I get this question so much. And in fact, I'm often on panels. I go to the AWP conference, the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. And we often, if it's a Native panel, we say before the panel starts, no one can ask this question, okay? Because we get this question a lot, okay? Now, everybody, I'm not the expert here, and I don't speak for all writers of color or all Native writers. I only speak for myself. I personally, this is just my belief, think it is fine for writers to write outside of their own experience and identity, okay? Now, I can tell you that many of my colleagues disagree vehemently. Now, I'm thinking though of the wonderful writer Joe Ide. If you have read his book, what is it called, IQ? He writes about a Black character. Steph Cha, my friend Steph Cha, in her book Your House Will Pay, she's got a Black character in there. She is not Black. I think the question here, and this is just my 2 cents, the issue here is if you are an author writing outside of your own experience, I think you need to consider 2 issues. Why are you writing this character that is outside of your own identity? Why? Is it strictly necessary? Okay. Is it absolutely necessary to the telling of the story? Okay. If it's not, maybe you want to reconsider that. If you're just putting in a native there to make it exotic or something, or a Latino person or a Black person, and especially if it's your protagonist, I think you need to really think that through carefully. Okay. But I'm not going to be the person that says you can't do this or you can't do that. Okay. Because I think writers should be free to write what they want, but be aware of doing things the right way and writing in a respectful fashion. I would also say that if you're going to do this, you need to do research, obviously, to avoid stereotypes and inaccurate information. If you're writing a native character and you're making him a drunk, then I probably have a problem, okay? Because you probably didn't need to put that stereotype in, okay? So I would say you need to do some pretty serious research to avoid stereotypes. And then the question, I often get a follow-up question, so I'll just ask it now. Should I hire a sensitivity reader? I think it's a decent idea. If you're not aware, a sensitivity reader is someone for a fee. My understanding is the standard fee is $250 to $500. And no, I don't do them, okay? The fee is that, and a person of color that is immersed in that culture will read a manuscript to tell you if you have flagged, if you have raised any red flags or been offensive, okay? I don't see the harm in it, and I think it can often help with some things. Like, for example, if I were to read a manuscript as a sensitivity reader, we don't actually use the term Native American ourselves, okay? So, that is, we don't mind using it. It's not offensive. But when Native people get together, they rarely would say Native American. It's more of an academic term, so that's something, if you want your book to be truthful, you would want to know how Native folks actually speak, okay? So I don't think that there is anything wrong with sensitivity readers, again. All right, so I feel that I've blathered on long enough. I hope that I've given, and I saw one question already come in the chat. Let me open it up here, and let me just say it's been a lot of fun here, and I am happy to talk about any of the questions regarding multicultural literature. I'm also happy to talk about publishing questions as well. I'm a newbie. I'm the first to admit it. I'm a rookie here, but I'm happy to share with you what I've learned in this journey that I've taken over the last year. So,
David,
yes.
This is Chris Goff,
Hey, Chris.
and I just want to let you know that I have unmuted. I've allowed everyone to unmute themselves. So if someone has a question, maybe raise your hand and David can, call on you.
Yeah,
I saw some questions coming over the chat.
Yeah, there are some questions that have come over the chat. If you want to answer those first.
Sure. I don't know how to do the chat. Can you read them to me, Lori? Or
Sure, absolutely. So how do you feel about white authors like Tony Hillerman and Margaret Cole, who have had long careers writing about Native Americans?
Yeah, this is a tough one for me because, I have a deep respect for Ann Hillerman, whom I've met, and I understand Margaret Cole is local. And I'm going to be honest here, okay? I personally don't have a problem with her, and Craig Johnson, who's actually a friend of mine, okay? Craig Johnson is, he and I are buddies. But Craig Johnson is a little bit different. Craig Johnson does not write in the Longmire series. His Native characters are not the protagonists in the way that Tony Hillerman's are. I personally don't have a problem with Tony Hillerman, okay? I can tell you that about 75% of my native writing compatriots do not agree with me. I can tell you that they disagree strongly, and they feel that when you write outside of your culture, you're taking away publishing opportunities for a person of color. I can tell you that is sort of the consensus. I can tell you that I don't agree. I think that Tony did do it with a lot of sensitivity, and I feel Ann Hillerman has been very sensitive to Native issues. I'm not as familiar with Margaret Cole's books. I haven't read one, but I've read a lot of the Tony Hillermans. So when I get together with my Native writing friends, I just don't talk about it because I don't need to get into an argument. So I personally don't have a problem, but I can tell you that there's the idea that there needs to be more spaces for writers of color, and so that's the issue. So it's a fair question. It really is.
So Martha wants to know, can you talk a little bit about the origins of winter counts and the writing process? She said she learned a ton, but she also appreciated living on the reservation among the Lakota Sioux people for a while.
Oh, thank you so much for reading the book. I missed who did the question, but whoever it was, thank you so much. You know, the inspiration for Winter Counts was in my day job. I'm a professor of Native American Studies. I'm an attorney, although I don't practice anymore. I have donated my time to the Denver Indian Family Resource Center, which is an organization that protects Native adoptive kids and foster kids. And then I did get a PhD in political science. And so I've been an academic for many years. And I was writing these little articles that nobody gave two hoots about. Okay, I'd write an academic article about Native issues, and maybe 10 people would read it. If I was lucky, 10 people would read it, you know. And I've always loved fiction. I've always been a bookworm like all of us. But when you grow up poor the way I did, it takes a while to give yourself permission to write. You know, when I grew up, I never wanted to be like my parents with the bill collectors calling and getting evicted. So I said, what's a good, safe job? It's being a lawyer, right? Lawyers always have jobs. And so I didn't start writing fiction until the middle of my life, to be honest with you. So I had been teaching about Native issues for quite a long time, and I knew how outrageous the Major Crimes Act was, and just the disaster of law enforcement on reservations. Our reservation is the size of Delaware. We have 10 police officers, and they don't all work at the same time. It's a disaster, law enforcement on our res. And so I knew about these issues, and so I finally said, you know, I'm going to see if I can't write about these issues and try to bring them to life. So that was really the inspiration. And Mike, you and I think were in a class way back at the Lighthouse, Mike McClanahan, I want to say 2013, 2014, you read an early draft of the book, I think way back in the day, or a chapter of it. But, you know, the writing process was like all of us, you know, I've got kids and it's I got up at 4 a.m. every day for 18 months, every day, 7 days a week, 4 a.m. And I would get those 2 hours of writing in before the kids started screaming. So that was the writing process,
So kind of related to the Major Crimes Act in writing, Arliss wants to know. She said, I believe the same is true in Canada, and I first read about the comparable law when W.P. Kinsella wrote Dance Me Outside many years ago. Have you read Dance Me Outside? If so, did it inspire you anyway? And do you know if the Canadian law still exists? And she also says, and yes, like Sherman Alexie, I understand there was controversy around Kinsella, but my questions remain.
I own the book. I haven't read it, to be honest with you. Like all of us, you know, there's only so much time in the day. And so I own it. And so I haven't read it. So I have to kind of dodge this question. And I'm also woefully undereducated about the Canadian system. I truly don't understand their laws. I think I can talk fairly decently about American laws, but the Canadian system, honestly, I just don't know. So I don't want to, I just have to kind of tell you, I don't know. So, but I'd like to learn, so I have to leave it there.
What would it take to change this major crimes law?
So the Major Crimes Act would have to be amended in Congress. And so I can tell you that a congressperson has reached out and has, because I published an essay in the New York Times in July. So, in July, I wrote not a fictional essay, but a nonfiction essay, and I wrote at Times. It's on my webpage if anybody's interested. I think they've dropped the paywall on it, so I could be wrong about that. But I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in July, and that got a lot of attention because the circulation of the Times is 4 million people, And so I have had some policymakers reach out to me. And now that we have a change in the administration, I think there's a reasonable, chance. Oh, thank you, Frank. I think there's a reasonable chance that there could be a change, but it would have to be an act of Congress to either amend it, in some way. So yeah, Congress would have to act.
I thought I saw somebody with their hand up. Sharon, did you have a question? No? Okay. Well, I have a question because I do write about I do have a protagonist who is of mixed race. And I just released the first book of that, but I have had some people question, but I haven't had as much controversy as I thought, except that I didn't use it enough and I didn't go into enough detail of her experience of being a person of color and being in a man's world, being an FBI agent. But what advice would you have for those of us who need to do our research? I mean, what is the best way other than not to avoid the stereotypes, to really get, is it simply talking to people actually in that role? Is there really any other better thing to do other than that?
Well, I'm not well versed in writing outside of my culture, as my protagonist was Native, so I'm not really an expert here. I can just use my general sense is that yes, digging into the research, going to the community. I know that somebody that wrote a book about Natives, they actually came to our reservation and the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is right next to ours, and they lived there for a year just to immerse themselves in that. Now, not all of us can do that. That's
Right.
some research right there, So that's my sense of what you can do. Yeah. Oh, and I see something coming up on chat. Hey, Mike. I can only read half of the question though because my window is cutting it off.
It says, aren't writers like Johnson, Cole, and Hillerman raising interest in Native issues and opening the door for more Native writers?
I think so. Mike, I agree with you. I can't remember if we talked about that so many years ago, but I adore Craig Johnson and I adore the Longmire series. I think he writes about Natives the right way because he avoids the stereotypes where, he doesn't write that we're like, oh, we worship the earth and mystical and all that. I mean, he, in his books and especially the TV series, you've got good Natives, you've got bad Natives. He writes, to me, complicated, interesting characters. And so I adore Craig Johnson's books. But again, keep in mind that Walt Longmire is not Native. The problem that some Native people have is in the Hillerman's books, Lee Porn and She, the protagonists there are Native. And they feel that you shouldn't write a protagonist out of your own experience. As I said, I personally don't agree with that. I necessarily would, I'm not sure I would express that opinion around my Native buddies. I think, people should be free to write what they want as long as they do so in a respectful and informed manner. But I understand that there's huge diversity of opinions on this. And I do feel that Tony Hillerman did some good for the Native world by raising some of these issues. So yeah, it's a complicated issue. It really is.
Agreed.
I have a question. Okay, I got to figure out how I say this, so I don't want to upset anybody at all. But my friend Gary Phillips, do you know Gary? I adore Gary, and he and I were talking about the issues of writing race in crime fiction, and I expressed to him some concern at some point about the fact that so as not to offend anybody, I'm afraid I'm going to be writing my white female agent character who's always coming up against white villains or, you know, white men who are doing bad things, or, you know, and become very homogenous. And I don't think it's realistic to always put, like you say, people are bad. Some people are bad that are people of color as well as white people. So do you have any advice on how to approach that? I mean, he said they were struggling with that and talking about that in the Writers of Color chat, because they don't want to write all wonderful Black people and Hispanic people and have all the white people be bad either. So it's, you know, it's very complicated.
You know, it is complicated, and I see the conundrum here. You know, in my book, I don't want to give away the spoilers, but one of the bad guys is Native, as we find out at the end. You know, and you know, but that was less problematic for me. Having said that, I did get some fan letters. I mean, I think by now most of us who published, you know, 99% of my letters were gracious, and I loved it and fantastic. You know. But did I get a couple of letters? Yeah, I sure did. I mean, like somebody told me that I was wrong on guns. Okay, fine. You know, I guess the gun stuff always comes up. You know, I'm not a gun guy. I may have messed up on the gun stuff. And somebody else said that I slightly misstated something. But somebody on the reservation was like, you know, you made one of the bad guys Native, and you made us look bad. Okay. And hey, you know, I mean, newsflash, there are good Native people, bad Native people, and like many of us, complicated somewhere in between, you know. And so I wrote my truth as best I could. But I see that the issue is made considerably more complicated if you're Caucasian and you're writing a villain that is of color. I can see how you would have some understandable reticence to write that, and that's a tough question. I mean, I'm certainly not the expert on any of this. It's just my debut book. All right, you all have been thinking about this a lot longer than I have, you know. Writing the other. Okay, nice. I love all this stuff coming in. So I don't have any great answers for this except write your truth and avoid the stereotypes. My goodness, you know, that is the thing that will get you hung up every time. You know, if I read something and somebody makes a Native person, you know, just a flat out drunk, I'm probably going to be first in line to be like, why did you do that? You know, I did see something in chat come up and said, would it be okay if you linked the Rosebud? Absolutely. So I have donated all of my speaking fees this year to the Rosebud Sioux Tribe COVID-19 Fund. My people are getting hit hard by COVID. And a lot of my people, I mean, if you don't know, it's an economic disaster on most reservations, made even worse by the pandemic. My people, many of them can't even afford masks, and we can't quarantine because you often have 2 or 3 families living in a little trailer. And so I've spoken to about 15 or 20 book clubs and many other groups. I've done over 75 appearances, but I've donated 100% of my fees to the COVID-19 fund. You know, so by all means, folks, if you have even $20 or whatever, I think you just linked it. And if anybody wants to go to my website at davidweiden.com, it's under book clubs, and there's a link there. You know, I mean, even $10-20 helps them out. I mean, it's absolutely, the hospitals are so full there, or at least they were 2 or 3 weeks ago, that they were treating people in the gift shop, the waiting room. You know, and our hospital is bad to begin with. If you read my book, we get, and I'm keeping an eye on the time here, we get the worst doctors. We get the doctors that have like lost their licenses in other places, and they send them to the reservation. And so we often get, our medical system is not great to begin with, but it's really getting hit hard now. So yeah, folks, any help you can give is deeply appreciated.
I will say your book was extremely eye-opening. I mean, it was things that I've heard, but not focused on so much. And so raising that awareness is so important.
Well, thank you.
I think your book is great. It's really worth reading.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Sharon has one question. She says, are you aware of the American Dirt controversy? And what is your take on that?
Oh boy. I'm not sure that I'm qualified to speak on this because I am not aware of all of the issues. And so my understanding is that she does have some Latino heritage. Again, I'm going to defer to Manuel or others or people who know more about this. So I've already forgotten her name. And so she wrote about Mexico, but she's Puerto Rican. Is that right? Or no? I honestly don't know. And so for me, the big surprise was not so much, that, but this is my debut book. I didn't understand that the lead title in the big 5 imprints are going to get 95% of the resources. I was not the lead. Okay, my publicity budget from Echo was not large. Okay, I love Echo; they were fantastic. But the lead last summer was Natasha Trethewey's book, which was rightfully the lead. She won the Pulitzer Prize in poetry. Her memoir is fantastic. So I agreed that they made her the lead. And my understanding is the American Dirt book was the lead. Like they flew her out and gave her like before the pandemic hit, a catered dinner, right, with like barbed centerpieces and such. I think, wow, I didn't know that they did that for authors. I got nothing like that. The other issues, honestly, I'm just not qualified to speak on. I have not read the book. I don't plan to read it. I got to defer to people that have more knowledge on that. It's a fair question, though. Yeah, I know, right? None of us get that treatment. I know. I'm waiting for it, someday. I'd like that, honestly, my travel budget, my entire budget was I got $80 for 2 tanks of gas. I kid you not. That was the totality. I'm not joking. That was the totality of my budget. Having said that, Echo did fantastic with the budget that we had. They got the word out there, but I didn't get much, advertising support. I see a question coming up in chat. I am working on the sequel to Winter Counts. And so that is coming out. And so I'm working on that. I have some short stories. I can talk about a couple of them now. I have a short story which has Virgil Wounded Horse, the protagonist of this book. That's coming out in a great anthology called Midnight Hour. That's coming out from Crooked Lane in September. I have another Virgil Wounded Horse story coming out in the BoucherCon anthology. I'm not sure when that is going to be out, but they asked me if I'd write a story for that, and I said absolutely. And so, so I'm writing stories and trying to write the next book and just trying to hang in there. Oh, thank you so much for the wonderful thoughts on the Rosebud Sioux Tribe COVID Fund, because it's I can vouch for this charity. 100% of the donations go to medical supplies. It's not one of these charities where they pay people and give salaries and such. I know for a fact it is completely valid and much needed. So I'm deeply appreciative.
Okay. Sue, did you have a comment?
Unmute myself. Yeah, I just wrote in the chat that I feel very strongly that if you live and work in an urban environment, and I have for many years, grew up in Chicago, lived in LA for many years, lived in Savannah, Georgia, that diversity is reality, and all of us from all backgrounds, I think, need to learn how to write diverse characters, whether we're whites writing about Native Americans or vice versa. This is something I think we all need to learn how to do. I have a series, co-partner journalists, one of whom is an African-American woman, and she's based on my very first partner when I was in the news. I was a news camera woman, one of the first ever, many years ago, and she was the only Black reporter. So they always put us together, and we got to be really good friends. And I remember this was in Michigan, in Lansing, Michigan, which was very much like it is today, very right-wing kind of a place. And the woman who was the gatekeeper at the state police department just couldn't stand me because she felt like I was taking a job away from a man, as if I didn't have a family to support also. But it's very complicated. I had several agents and publishers fearful of, even though they liked my work, once they realized I was not an African-American woman, they were very reticent about taking on the book, because they were afraid that a white writer writing Black characters, you know, they didn't want the blowback if there were any problems or mistakes. But I've had great deal of support from the Black community, from Black friends of mine. And, you know, I really focus on the similarities between us, which I think are huge rather than the differences. I think we're in a time of kind of identity politics right now where we're just all super sensitive, almost over the top in terms of the possibility of making errors in depiction. And it's also an assumption that all of the groups are similar. You know, I mean, within a group of Black folks, my character grew up in a small town in South Georgia. She is nothing like an urban Black person from Los Angeles, totally different background. So I think we need to be aware that within the groups too, there's such great diversity. So just my 2 cents worth of observations.
Very true. Well, I know we're getting on towards past 8:15. Does anybody else have any questions? Any final thoughts, David? Thank you so much. This was so wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I just want to give my gratitude to all of you. This group, I only got to go to one live meeting before the pandemic hit where I met Manuel and Kate Lansing, who's a great friend, and Margaret, and I can't wait till this darn thing is behind us because I would love to hang out with everybody again. And I just want to tell you how honored and humbled I am by the fact that you guys have welcomed this newbie into your ranks. And so I really, really mean that. And so, you know, oh, wait, did I see Cynthia come in? Oh, is that Cynthia? Hey, Cynthia, who we work together. Yeah. And so, you know, so it has just been, you know, truly wonderful to be part. And I just want to say thank you all for having me.
Well, thank you so much, David. Can't wait to meet you in person. Or at least at VoucherCon. Are you going to VoucherCon?
I sure am. I wouldn't miss it.
Me too. I just signed up. I just signed up today. I'm hoping we all get to go.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank